Home is where the heart is, and it should be the only place you can count on for both comfort and safety. But not all homes are alike, and not all of them are built in safe places. As we'll see in today's video, some houses are built in the worst places you can imagine. Join me as we take a look at 15 of the most dangerous houses in the world. Number 15. The Hanging Monastery. The higher the home, the closer you are to God, right? Well, maybe that's what the monks at the Hanging Monastery in China were thinking when they built this structure sometime between the 4th and 5th centuries. The Hanging Monastery has been turning heads and cranking necks for more than 1,400 years, and hopefully won't be going anywhere anytime soon, because it's got a rich history. It's the only temple in China dedicated to Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and encompasses over 40 halls, and it's home to more than 80 Buddhist sculptures, all made of bronze, iron, stone, and mud. This place is old, but it's also tough not to notice its location, as it sits 246 feet up, with most of the structure being held up on stilts. It's not the type of place where you want to look down from, and if heights aren't really your thing, then perhaps this place isn't the right one to come and find some inner peace. And just thinking about how high the monks had to climb and how they built much of this by hand all those years ago without falling to their doom is enough to make your head spin. And while the location of the Hanging Monastery keeps it safe from high winds and storms, it can't help but feel like one of the most dangerous homes in the world. Number 14. Lichtenstein Castle. Castles are supposed to be the safest place in the kingdom. With fortified defenses, dangerous moats full of alligators and archers, and the towers ready to rain on invaders, what could possibly go wrong? Well, just ask the walls of the Lichtenstein Castle in Germany, because I'm sure they've got a story to tell. While it may look like a fairy tale castle from head on, all you have to do is go around to the back of the castle to see why it's one of the most dangerous houses. It's built right at the edge of a cliff, and it's not a small cliff either. The castle's actually only 200 years old and was built over the ruins of a former castle, but that doesn't mean the city planning needed to be medieval too. So if you're lucky enough to visit the interior, just make sure you're not unlucky enough to stick your head out of one of these rear windows a little too far, because there's no Prince Charming or Luck Dragon here who's going to swoop in and save you at the last second. And not even Rapunzel's hair is long enough to make it to the bottom. But despite looking like it could go at any moment, Lichtenstein Castle has been through a lot, including surviving a tank shell during World War II. Number 13. Sutyagan House. Also known as the Wood Skyscraper, the Sutyagan House is the most famous residence in Russia, and it's not hard to see why. Standing 144 feet tall with 13 stories, the Sutyagan House is the home of Russian entrepreneur Nikolai Sutyagan. He began building this home back in 1992, with his original plan being not to go higher than 2 stories, and taking his inspiration from the wooden homes of Japan and the Netherlands. But the architecture spoke to him so much that he decided 2 stories wasn't enough, and he was going to keep going and going and going until he created what we see here today. He claimed that somehow the house looked too weird and ungainly with just 2 stories, and so he added until he was finally happy with how his home looked. But there's a bit of a catch. The entire home is made of wood, making it a 3-story tinderbox. The Sutyagan House was built without any of the necessary permits, making it an illegal structure, as well as a massive fire hazard, which is why it was condemned in 2008. Sutyagan even spent some time in prison, and without his upkeep, the wooden home began to deteriorate. So on top of being ready to ignite at the drop of a hat, that wood was having a harder time holding together with each passing day. By 2009, 11 of the Sutyagan House's 13 stories were torn down, finally making it a 2-story house, and the remains were finally destroyed in 2012. It doesn't take much for even our best ideas to go up in flames. Number 12. Meteoro Monasteries. For whatever reason, monks like to take things a little higher. And while the more modern world will just build a skyscraper and live in the penthouse, monks will instead build their modest homes high in the mountains. Sure, the views might be spectacular, but the air is thin and the falls are long. But that's the life of an old-timey monk, I guess. The Meteoro Monasteries is perched right at the top and on the edge of the sandstone peaks of Greece. Only 60 monks and nuns live in the monastery, and for centuries it's been a fortress of solitude, offering them not just peace and quiet, but protection from any unwanted trespassers and aggressors. Because if you want to get up here, you better be ready to climb. Chances are, not even God himself is going to get you up there. But despite the precarious location, the Meteoro Monastery is one of the most visited places in the country, especially because of the sweeping view of the flat fields that surround the area. These monasteries have become so popular, in fact, that it's been used as the location for big productions like Game of Thrones. And while it's unlikely that people who built it in the 14th century didn't plan on their monasteries becoming so popular, I'm sure they wouldn't mind. Number 11. Castelfoli della Roca. The next on the list of dangerous houses may be familiar to those out there who speak a bit of Catalan. The Castelfoli della Roca is a cute and quaint little town that sits right on the edge of a cliff. But things weren't always so dangerous here. The town was once a bit less daring, but after years of erosion, we have what we see here today, which is a 160-foot drop down into the river below. But despite the geography of the real estate, Spain's castle has been inhabited for the last 1,000 years, and you can still visit the denizens today. But just be careful, because even the children here know not to chase a rogue ball too far, lest they experience that long drop. The town has a medieval feel to it, with the narrow stone streets and fortified ramparts, which were used during the Civil War. But to make Castelfoli della Roca even wilder, the majority of the structure here is built from dark volcanic rock, which serves as the bedrock of the town. So not only is this place built right at the edge of a cliff, but it's volcanic too, with much of the natural formations being attributed to lava flows. Number 10. Lake Michigan Shadow Cliff. When it comes to the house on Lake Michigan, simply known as Shadow Cliff, things are pretty cut and dry. The house has a modern and minimalist design. Built in the late 1960s, this house is a glass box that seemingly dangles off the edge of a cliff. The home is designed by famous Chicago architect Harry Weiss, who was known for his strange designs, but this one seems to be the strangest and most controversial. The home was built with the purpose of being a vacation home for bigwig business executives who quite literally wanted to live life on the edge. From the front end, Shadow Cliff looks normal, but as you make your way to the back, you'll notice the 1,000-foot drop into the abyss below. But as long as you don't walk to the edge of the back room, you should be fine, right? Well, wrong. Because Weiss had a porthole cut right into the floor to remind anyone vacationing here exactly what awaits them if things go south. So yeah, it's safe to say that this house isn't built for the faint of heart. And while that porthole may be terrifying, the anxiety of knowing just how close to the big plunge the home is enough to keep anyone on edge. But despite the horrors of the location, the view is enough to give the Shadow Cliff a price tag of over $2 million. Number 9. The Chemosphere. The 1960s were a wild time in the West. The youth were trying out new, forward ways of thinking. The civil rights movement was in full effect in the United States, and people were experimenting with all sorts of things, even architecture. The Chemosphere was designed as a modern abode in Los Angeles, California, in 1960 by John Lautner. At the time, Lautner was applauded by critics and experts for the octagonal design, but the rest of us were left scratching our heads and shaking in fear because his Chemosphere seems to float in the air over the hills below. The Chemosphere looks like a UFO trying to land in the rough terrain of LA's hills. So what exactly is going on in this thing? When Lautner surveyed the area the Chemosphere sits on, he was given two options: level out the sloped land, which would take too much time and even more money, not to mention hurt the ecosystem, or just build a single 30-foot column to support the house, which is what gives it its hovering appearance. He obviously chose the latter, which only cost $30,000, and while Lautner would assure you that the house is fine, it's not hard to be left shaking in your boots once you're inside this 8-sided abode. And despite the fear, the Chemosphere is now worth well over $3 million. Number 8. The Drina River House. The Drina River House is a tiny little house made of wood, hiding away in rural Serbia. And with a name like River House, you'd think that this home was prime waterfront property. Well, yes and no, because the Drina River House sits on a tiny rock literally in the middle of the river. This dangerous home was built in 1968, and because of the poorly planned location, it's been destroyed several times from flooding. I guess you can't blame the homeowners for wanting a little peace and quiet, but this home may be a little more trouble than it's worth, and as its safety depends directly on the tides, ebbs, and flows of the river, if there's a bad storm, then forget about it. Ironically, the Drina River House was built by a group of local swimmers who wanted to get some shelter when the conditions of the river got a little too rough, but in the end they built a structure that's now just as susceptible to Mother Nature as they were. Nowadays, the Dina River House serves better as a fun local monument than it does as a livable house. And if you do want to live there, you would better know how to swim, because how else will you get to the grocery store? Number 7. Gate of Europe Towers. Every major city in the world has some sort of skyscraper or tower that maintains its status as a tourist attraction. It would seem that everyone these days is trying to outdo everyone else, and there's no sign of slowing down. But how do you manage to stay relevant? Well, why not build a tower on a slant? Or how about 2 slanted towers? The Gate of Europe Towers are some of the most precarious structures in the modern world, and really know how to lean into their fame. The Gate of Europe Towers can be found in Madrid, Spain, and reach about 375 feet high, but exist on a 15-degree angle lean. And although the structures are safe and sound, why risk getting a little too close? Because if you subscribe to Murphy's Law, where if anything can go wrong, it will, then the Gate of Europe Towers is best appreciated from a distance. But just imagine being one of the thousands of brave souls who come in and out of here every day, day after day. Each respective tower holds 26 stories. It even houses helipads on the roof. Yeah, that probably makes for one funky landing. These structures look like they're just one bad earthquake away from collapsing in on each other. Number 6. Zoco Apartments. We've seen some strange floating houses so far, but this next one really stands above the rest. The Zoco Apartments in Holland are some of the most dangerous looking of their kind. From afar, everything about these apartment buildings seems a-okay, but when you get close, you'll notice all of the units that simply jut out from the building, dangling above the sidewalk below. So if you're inside one of these apartments, yeah, it's best not to look down, but if you walk underneath them, it's best not to look up. You just can't win with a design like this, but the story of the Zoco Apartments is just as strange as their design. Originally, a housing corporation drafted plans for 100 units to house the elderly. Only the original site wasn't up to code, so instead of finding a new blank space, they simply found some existing buildings and slapped those extra units on the sides of them. Yeah, I'm not joking. How something outlandish and potentially dangerous could ever be given the green light is anybody's guess. But alas, these floating, almost glued-on units exist, and they found brave souls to live in them. The Zoco Apartments are a great, albeit scary way for folks to live out their golden years on the edge. Number 5. Habitat 67. Designed by the Israeli-Canadian architectural student Moshe Safdie, the goober of a building that is Habitat 67 was built for the World's Fair Expo in 1967. During the 60s, much of the Western world was looking towards the future during the space race, so there's no doubt that Safdie assumed that much of our homes would look like this Habitat 67. Luckily for us, he was wrong, and the only thing scarier than living in one of these units is standing under them, because these homes look like a giant toddler dropped their giant blocks and someone decided to put windows and doors on them. Habitat 67 is 12 stories high and composes 354 prefabricated concrete units, arranged in all sorts of wild and ambitious combinations and different sizes, all of which look suspended in midair. But looking on the bright side, each unit has access to at least one private terrace, and despite the frantic design, every unit has total privacy. So I guess there is a method to the madness after all. It's just that sometimes you have to peel back the many dangerous layers to get to the good idea. Though the complex did launch Safdie's career to the moon, he went on to design about 80 more buildings around the world. The odds of anyone designing something like Habitat 67 again are pretty much slim to none, thankfully. Number 4. Free Spirit Sphere House. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the most dangerous, and that rule definitely applies to houses too. The fun and funky Free Spirit treehouses offer something a little more otherworldly without having to leave the Earth's atmosphere, although it does come at a cost. One false move and you're toast. These small, minimal spherical treehouses are just one room, and they're all accessible through the outdoor spiral staircases that make their way around a tree trunk, leading to a small personal suspension bridge. These Free Spirit treehouses can get pretty high up there, so if you're coming home after a long day at the office or a late night out, one little misstep and you're looking at a broken ankle or leg. These small spheres are made with local materials, including spruce and fiberglass, and many of the interiors are adorned with indigenous paintings, so the folks inside can really reconnect with the land and get a little bit of a history lesson as well, as long as they remember not to look down. Living minimally can be fun, but all it takes is for a few wires to snap or some old trees to become a little too creaky, and the sphere is done for. Yeah, and don't forget about the likelihood of a forest fire. Perhaps the only folks truly suited to live high up in the trees are the animals and the elves. Number 3. Aquaburg Lighthouse. When you see a beautiful lighthouse in the distance, your first reaction may be cool. But to lighthouse keepers everywhere, they may say home. And while that solitude may seem fun to folks living in the hustle and bustle of the city, it can be enough to drive someone mad. Lighthouses are dangerous, with the Aquaburg Lighthouse in Denmark being the top dog. Sitting right at the tip of Faroe Island, the Aquaburg Lighthouse is not the type of home where you can just easily pull your car into the driveway. For starters, you need to take the 2-hour ferry from the mainland to the island of Surrey, giving you plenty of time to think about how badly you want to live in the old lighthouse. Once you arrive in the small village of Sumba, you'll get to embark on the 2-mile hike up to the structure. And while the views may be breathtaking, so is the drop, because it's one long way down from there. Once you finally get to the lighthouse, you're met with wet, jagged rocks, the sea cliffs, and of course the waves that seem to crash down on all sides. So if you do make it here in one piece, make sure to give yourself a well-deserved pat on the back. Number 2. East Church Cliff Houses. Sometimes you can tell a house is dangerous just by looking at it, but sometimes you don't know just how bad things can be until it's too late, which is the unfortunate case with the East Church Cliff Houses. The homes in southern England were some prime real estate, situated at the edge of a cliff with the best views in the neighborhood. No one thought anything of it, as there are plenty of safe cliffside dwellings all over the world. But just last year in 2020, the edge of the cliff completely collapsed, taking a lot of homes with it. In the end, 20 homes were left totally uninhabitable, with many of them sitting in a pile of million-dollar rubble at the bottom. But what was the big issue here? Why did something like that happen? The homes themselves were built up to code, but it was Mother Nature in the end who took them all down in the blink of an eye. Turns out that the East Church Cliff was slowly but surely eroding. There was even a time when the homes were a safe distance away, but decades of waves crashing against the rocks finally took their toll. Number 1. Kechke Pillar. We've seen some strange and dangerous houses today, but the home on Kechke Pillar in Georgia puts them all to shame. As the name would imply, this dangerous house sits at the very top of a 130-foot pillar. The structure is a church, which is home to monks during medieval times who just wanted a place where they could get away from it all. But in the end, the Kechke Pillar was so isolated and cut off from the rest of the world below that if you lived there, you also died there. There was simply nowhere else to go, and getting up and down proved to be too arduous of a task. Making it to the top alone was a sign of your piety and convictions, so why spoil that by coming back down? Once the last monk died, the Kechke Pillar remained abandoned until 1995, when one local monk returned to the holy site to restore it to its former glory, and of course take up residency. The only way for this monk to reach the top was by climbing a centuries-old iron ladder, which is so dangerous that the local government is warned against its use, because if you fall, well, that's the end of your story. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.